After the rat's been properly anesthetized and the hair has been clipped from the top of the head and ophthalmic ointment added to the surface of the eyes, we want to affix the head stereotaxic frame by first placing the upper incisors over the bite bar, making sure the tongue and lower incisors fall below the bite bar. It's really important that the tongue not be sandwiched between the bite bar and the roof of the mouth. Next, we'll set the ear bars and use them to align the head so that the bridge of the nose is fairly well centered with the apex of the nose bar on the frame. It's at this point that the head should feel solidly fixed to the frame. Being mindful of the eyes, we want to clean the surgical field with 70% isopropanol, which is also called isopropyl alcohol. After the alcohol is air dried, wipe down the same area with a betadine solution. The nose bar can now be lowered onto the bridge of the nose. So if you imagine my hand as being the surface of the skull, we're going to use the tip of the scalpel to penetrate the skin between the eyes, and then we're going to rock back so that the handle is almost parallel with the body. This will make for a smooth single incision back to between the ears. It is worth mentioning that I'm not simply drawing the blade to the back of the head, but rather drawing the blade back and simultaneously pushing the skin forward through the blade. This allows for a larger incision without having to cut beyond the base of the skull. Trace the perimeter of the skull like a raindrop and scrape away the periosteum, which is a layer of dense connective tissue. Once removed, place a micro retractor to hold the skin away from the skull surface. Any residual blood can be removed with a sterile cotton tip applicator or gauze. Sterile saline can also be used. Any small sources of blood can be cauterized to prevent excessive bleeding into the surgical field. Once bleeding is controlled, mark the two reference points on the skull, bregma and then lambda. Next, attach the stereotaxic arm with the drill press to the frame and align the ball burr bit directly above bregma using the adjustment dials. The coordinates for the first electrode site is 2 mm anterior of bregma and 3 mm lateral of bregma. If you think of it like a math coordinate plane with bregma serving as the origin, the XY coordinates would be -3, 2, respectively. Once properly positioned directly above the first electrode site, start the drill and lower it using the vertical dial. The thickness of an adult rat skull is about the same as the diameter of the drill bit itself, just slightly less than 1 mm. Since the second electrode site is also 2 mm anterior of bregma, simply move the drill 6 mm to the right. If you prefer to go back to bregma, the XY coordinates for the second site would be 3, 2 from bregma. The third electrode site is 6 mm posterior of the second site, or 3, -4 if you go back to bregma. The fourth site is 6 mm to the left of the third site, or if you're starting from bregma, -3, -4. The same style ball burr bit is used in oral surgery because it's suitable for cutting into dense material while leaving soft tissue unharmed. So the application for drilling into bone while minimizing damage to the dura is appropriate. This doesn't mean that the bleeding is completely avoidable. In situations where bleeding cannot be controlled by suture or an electrocautery, you can use a pair of fine-tipped tweezers to tease away some cotton from the tip of a sterile applicator. You can then roll it into a small ball and place it snugly into the hole. This will control the bleeding while allowing you to continue working. The fifth and final electrode will be the reference electrode. It'll be placed anterior of the second electrode and to the right of the midline. At this point, we are done with the drill and can start placing the electrodes themselves. These electrodes will serve two purposes. One is to conduct the electrical signal from the surface of the brain, and the second purpose is to anchor the entire head cap in place. There is no need to screw the electrode flush with the skull. This would put unnecessary pressure on the brain. More importantly, at the end of this procedure, we will be adding dental acrylic to hold everything in place. The acrylic needs to be able to get under the head of the electrode to hold on more securely. If the electrode is screwed all the way flush, the dental acrylic will simply cover the head of the electrode like a cap. Once the electrode bites into the hole, 3 revolutions should be enough. You should still be able to see about half the threads exposed, then you are good. I'm now going to remove the cotton ball we placed earlier. The bleeding should have subsided. You can always clean up any spots with the cautery again. Place another ball of cotton on the surface while getting the connector piece set up for soldering. Solder the implanted electrodes in order from front to back to the underside of the connector, working from the rightmost pin to the leftmost pin. The reference electrode, being the furthest and most anterior, will be soldered into pin 1 on the right side of the connector. It is very important to note that I am touching the tip of the soldering iron to the solder in the pin and not the wire itself. Once the solder melts and looks like chrome, push the wire into the pin. Touching the wire with the soldering iron will melt the insulation and, worse, conduct heat down to the brain. The frontal left electrode will be soldered to the next pin to the left, followed by the front right electrode into pin 3. The rear left electrode will be in pin 4. While the rear right electrode will be in pin 5. The ground wire, already in place, is in pin 6. Once this is complete, release the connector from the helping hands. And turn it right side up in line with the body. Since the wires are insulated from each other, tuck them all underneath the connector as tightly packed as possible. Next, place a few grams of powdered dental acrylic in a disposable beaker. This is a 100 milliliter beaker, and you can see not much is needed. Now add a few milliliters of liquid acrylic, just enough to get all the powder wet but not soaking. This is a chemical reaction, and the two compounds need to be mixed thoroughly. At first it'll be very runny, so only apply a few drops to the head cap, allowing it to run underneath and all over the electrodes and wires. As the chemicals begin to cure in the beaker, it will thicken to the consistency of honey, and then like toothpaste. It's during this phase that more is applied to build up the thickness of the head cap. It's worth mentioning this is an exothermic reaction, so you will notice a slight amount of warmth, but this will not cause any burns to yourself or the rodent. Once the acrylic has fully cured, raise the nose bar and remove the retractors. The ground wire can be tucked at the nape of the neck above the muscle and below the skin. Curl the wire so that it can freely bend as the animal turns its head. The head cap won't allow for complete closure of the surgical site, but we will add some braided suture to the anterior and posterior edges of the incision. This will prevent the incision from tearing any further, as well as keep the skin snug up against the head cap. For this procedure, I am making a simple square knot with 3 or 4 throws on each. You'll want to be close to the incision edge, but not too close, or you'll risk tearing the suture through the skin. The principle is to bring the skin together, but not smash it together with so much pressure we restrict blood flow and healing. Add an antibacterial powder that also contains anti-inflammatory and anesthetic ingredients. This will aid in the healing process. To ensure the powder stays in place as long as possible, take a 2x2 gauze pad, unfolding it once, then folding it over on itself lengthwise. Next, wrap it firmly around the head cap and using a tissue clip, staple the gauze pad to itself. When the rodent is fully awake, they'll eventually knock it off on their own. This also aids with any residual bleeding, as well as keeping bedding out of the surgical site. You can now remove the ear bars and gently lift the front top incisors up and off of the bite bar. Let him wake up in his home cage, being mindful of the room temperature so he does not get cold. Well, it's been about 3 weeks since the implant. The rat's made a complete recovery in that he is ambulatory as well as eating and drinking normally. No odd behaviors or drop in body weight. The surgical site itself has healed well with no inflammation or scarring or no sign of infection. His hair has nearly grown all the way back in, and as you can see, he does not have any sensitivity to the surgical site being touched.